I'm Abby, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, 1 Minute Off. So if you've been with me on this channel for a while, you'll know that I just kind of talk about whatever I want. I don't really have a niche on here. I know you're not like supposed to do that or whatever, but here we are doing it. A while ago, I talked about 2 different unsolved murder cases from over 100 years ago, and how those are, cases we'll probably never get the answers to. But I find that kind of stuff very fascinating from time to time. I go down rabbit holes just like everyone else does, and I went down one the other day. And I figured it was maybe time to start getting back into that kind of content. Although, full disclosure, I'm not really talking about murders today. This video is going to be about accidental deaths that happen on film and television sets. So if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, definitely, don't watch this one. You can click away. I won't be mad, I promise. I think we often forget, through the immersive nature of television and film, that these productions are usually enormous projects that take hundreds, if not thousands, of people to complete. It's really easy to forget when you're watching it that the space the actors are in is in fact a workspace where actors and crew members and directors put their lives and bodies sometimes on the line to get the shot. Before we get the final polished product in the theater, there are so many hours behind the camera, which can include retake after retake of a scene, technical challenges, and sometimes, tragically, life-threatening risks. There have actually been hundreds of terrifying accidental deaths that happen on television or film sets over the past century. And I think it's interesting not only because, it obviously scars everyone working on the film set that day, but sometimes it also changes the industry as a whole, resulting in, more safety standards and reshaping how productions operate. But most of all, and most importantly, reminding everybody of the very real, human cost behind the art. So I just thought it'd be interesting to take a look at 5 different stories of actors or directors who passed away during filming something. Not to sensationalize their deaths, obviously, but to kind of figure out exactly what happened, find out in which ways the productions honored the deceased, and to better understand how their legacies continue to shape the industry they loved. So if you're still here, let's get started. The first accident happened all the way back in 1914. Director Otis B. Thayer was working on a short, silent film called Across the Border with the Colorado Motion Picture Company about gun smugglers at the border of Mexico and the U.S. Grace Forman, professionally known as Grace McHugh, was playing the role of a bandit's daughter. It was her first role in a film, but unfortunately it would also be her only role. On July 1st, 1914, they were filming a scene in which McHugh's character has to cross the Rio Grande, subbed in that day for the Arkansas River in Canyon City, Colorado, on horseback. Present that day was also Owen Carter, a cameraman working on the project alongside McHugh and Thayer. Sometime in the afternoon, McHugh rode into the river on horseback, into a point that was 125 feet wide and 3.5 feet deep. She was only about 30 feet out when her horse began to stumble and caused her to fall off into the water. Carter, seeing this, ran into the water after her, swimming about 320 feet towards her. However, unfortunately, as he reached her, they both seemed to quickly slip under the surface before any other aid could reach them. Most of the sources actually say this was a result of quicksand, including the original newspaper clipping from the July 2nd edition of the Colorado Transcript. Yeah, this is an actual case of death by quicksand. Interestingly, this report too, which was published the next day before the bodies were found, seems to imply that she fell from a boat rather than a horse. And interestingly, before the bodies were found, rumors actually began to spread that perhaps it was all just a marketing stunt for the movie. However, Carter's body was found 5 days later about a mile away from the filming site, and McHugh's was found 12 days later around 9 miles away. The movie was still released, and actually was released earlier in some places than it had been planned. But I couldn't find the movie online or, anywhere at all for that matter. But I looked more into it, and it seems like there was a good explanation for this. I mean, it was made in 1915. The movie itself was made with cellulose nitrate, which deteriorates and combusts over years and years. Actually, it was believed no movie from this production company had survived until a copy of Pirates of the Plains, which is another 1914 film, was recovered a while back. It is known that Carter was actively filming McHugh when she went under the water. However, in this specific case, the footage was not included in the film, and therefore is presumably lost to time. Even if they recovered the film, I don't think they would be able to recover the actual filming of the incident. A not so fun fact I also learned during this was that apparently 70% of silent films have been declared permanently lost by Congress. Moving along almost 60 years into the future, next on my list is Claudio Guerín. Guerín was a director who was born in 1913 in Seville, Spain. He was a director, screenwriter, and producer who studied at the Escuela Oficial de Cinematografía, or EOC, in Madrid. His directorial debut was in 1968 with Los Desafios, or The Challenges, which was 3 short stories about how normal mundane situations can easily degrade into violence. Then, in 1971, he directed Un Solo Gran Amore, or House of Pigeons, not a literal translation, which was a Spanish-Italian production, but his last film would be only 2 years later. In 1973, Guerín was directing La Campana dell'Inferno, or The Bell from Hell, a Spanish-French production. The movie told the story of an asylum inmate played by Renaud Verlet, who was tormenting his aunt and her 3 daughters. On one of the last days of shooting the film, Guerín climbed up a bell tower that had been constructed for the set. Most of the film scenes were centered around this tower. A few people who were on set that day say he was trying to prepare for a complicated shot. Others say he intentionally did it to end his own life. But regardless, Guerín fell from the top of the tower almost 60 feet to the ground below. He was pronounced dead before he was taken to the nearby hospital. Like I said, some speculated that he passed away from his own hand, and others are certain it was just this horribly timed misstep. The former group has this opinion due to the fact that the main character in the movie actually meets a very similar end that Guerín did, but a lot of skeptics argue that, ending his own life on set is a little dramatic, even for like a horror director. And a lot of these rumors kind of ended up just making his death more sensational than it really was. He didn't leave behind a note, he didn't leave behind instructions on how to finish the film. So, I think I'm of the opinion of the latter seems more likely than the former, I think, that he just lost his footing. The remainder of the scenes would be shot by Juan Antonio Bardem, a veteran filmmaker, who would also supervise the editing of the film. The movie is now known as the most accursed movie in Spanish cinema. A YouTube account that goes by the name of Fernando Ribes posted a recreation of Guerín's death for what I believe was a Spanish TV show about supernatural occurrences called Cuarto Milenio. The recreation is only 2 minutes long, and it's available to watch on YouTube. Other than that, there's really not a lot more information about this case. I'd kind of scoured for a while, but I really couldn't find anything. If anyone has more information about this case, please let me know below in the comments. The movie Steel from 1979, not to be confused with Steel 1997, with Shaquille O'Neal, is a movie about a bunch of construction workers building a skyscraper. And it stars Lee Majors, the $6 million man himself. Jennifer O'Neill plays the daughter of a man who wants to build the skyscraper, and she employs Majors and his team, which includes Big Lou Cassidy, played by George Kennedy. Without spoiling too much, as one might imagine from this entire, poster and premise, there is a scene where a character, Big Lou, falls to his death from the top of the skyscraper. However, this was not movie magic. Audiences were actually seeing a man really fall to his death on screen. A.J. Bakunas was a Jersey-born stunt worker who was well known in Hollywood at the time and had previously set the world record for a free fall by jumping from a helicopter at 230 feet in the air for the Burt Reynolds movie Hooper in 1978. However, that record was broken by a 280-foot drop performed by Dar Robinson, another famous stuntman at the time. Bakunas was hired as George Kennedy's stuntman for the movie. On the day of September 20th, 1978, he had actually already performed the stunt that was needed for Steel and had already been recorded and everything, but he was really determined to take this record back from Dar Robinson. He asked Lee Majors, who was also producing the film, if he could try another jump. Another jump from the 22nd floor of a construction site that was actually being built, at a whopping 315 feet in the air. Majors, for some reason, agreed, and a crowd of 1,000 people, including Bakunas' own father, watched as he leapt from basically the top of this active construction site. Cameras actively rolling. However, the life pack airbag that had been set up for the stunt had only been approved for falls around 100 feet. Bakunas had modified the airbag with the second pack to make it, a little bit safer beforehand. However, unfortunately, he would plummet through the air at a rate of 115 miles per hour, and as he hit the airbag, it would collapse immediately upon impact. It wasn't enough to kill him instantly, but the damage was enough to lead to his death the following day in the hospital. The doctors would say his lungs were so badly bruised that he would simply never recover. And you can actually watch this fall in real time on YouTube as well. Not even a recreation of it, the real thing. The accident resulted in a civil wrongful death case rather than a criminal prosecution. In a Louisiana court of law, the defendant, which was the Life Pack Manufacturing Company, was found not liable for 2 reasons. 1, because Bakunas had knowingly altered the product before he jumped, and 2, because there were no actual defects found in the airbags. Bakunas was actually found to have taken the risk on himself by modifying the device and knowingly using it in a way that was beyond its design. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about this is, as I mentioned earlier, they kept this footage in the movie. Steel was released once in August of 1980, with marketing that touted it as like this inspirational movie about miracles. However, since the movie basically bombed, they pulled it and re-released it again in November of 1980, with all different marketing that leaned more towards like a horror thriller under the title of Look Down and Die, with the tagline of "one slip and you're dead." So, news of this guy's death sweeps across the country because he's famous, and everyone knows he died filming this fall. But 2 years later, one could literally just go watch it on the big screen, which is kind of scary because more likely than not, most audiences would know exactly what was happening. The movie itself is dedicated to Bakunas' memory. There was only one theatrical Twilight Zone movie to accompany the 5-season television show from the 1950s, aptly named Twilight Zone the Movie, which came out in 1983. Vic Morrow was an American actor who had come to prominence through the ABC drama series Combat, where he played Sergeant Chip Sanders, which earned him an Emmy nomination in 1963. In 1982, he was cast for a lead role for a part in Twilight Zone the Movie by director John Landis, who was known for his previous work on Blues Brothers and Animal House. In this particular sequence, Morrow would play a racist man who was brought back in time to be placed in various situations where he would be a victim of racism himself. Very Twilight Zone premise. The third scene he was to film involved him playing a Vietnamese man persecuted by U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War. Morrow and two child actors, 7-year-old Myca Dinh and 6-year-old Renee Shin-Yi Chen, were filming in the Indiana Dunes near Santa Clarita in Los Angeles. Their scene involved fleeing from a helicopter during what was essentially a battle. According to sources, on the day of the accident, the pilot of the helicopter, who was also a Vietnam War veteran, was hovering about 25 feet from the ground near a mortar effect which is used to simulate explosions in films when he turned his helicopter 180 degrees to get the next shot. However, the effect was somehow detonated while the helicopter was still above it, causing the metal lid to strike the top of the helicopter's tail rotor, which made it detach. Already low-flying helicopter then began to spin out of control, right towards the ground where Morrow and the two children were filming their scene. At the same time this was happening, Morrow had accidentally dropped one of the children into the water as he raced across. Right as he goes to pick her back up, the helicopter lands on the 3 people in the water. Morrow and Lee were decapitated by the helicopter's blades, while Chen was crushed to death by the chopper's right landing skid. All 3 people died almost instantly. This is another clip that you can terrifyingly find on YouTube and see in full. Really it's not gory, it happens so fast. It happens so quickly, and it's terrifying. There was obviously a mountain of controversy around this case. In 1984, the NTSB filed their report on the accident, concluding that the proximity of the helicopter to the special effects explosions was a direct result of failure to establish communication between the pilot and Landis, who was in charge of the entire filming operation. The FAA had just installed regulations defining how aircraft were to be properly used for film productions. However, for some reason, this did not initially include helicopters. As a result of the Twilight Zone incident, the NTSB moved that these regulations should apply to all aircraft, and the language was officially incorporated in 1986. John Landis had hired these 2 children under the table, violating child labor laws for the production, though he was never convicted of this. Others would state that the nature of the stunts was way too over the top for the scene and were basically unnecessary for the story they were telling in the first place. Landis himself was actually said to have dismissed warnings about potential issues with the stunt earlier that day, saying, we might lose the helicopter. The trial that followed was described as long, controversial, and bitterly diverse. In the end, Landis and 4 other people were acquitted of involuntary manslaughter, and Steven Spielberg, who had actually worked with Landis in the production of the film, officially ended their friendship after the whole tragedy. Many people still feel that Landis never took full responsibility for the incident, and even has gone as far as to use it to leverage sympathy out of, other audiences that he has. This tragedy also resulted in the installation of a new general safety program a few years after. In 1987, the Office of the State Fire Marshal started the Motion Picture and Entertainment Safety Program in response to the accident and to industry concerns about inconsistent enforcement of fire prevention regulations and requirements. The program oversees motion picture and television industry use of pyrotechnic special effects in California. The last accident I want to talk about today comes from a British variety show called The Late Late Breakfast Show that ran from 1982 to 1986 on the BBC. It was presented by Noel Edmonds and would also feature people like Mike Smith or Smithy and John Peel, who were 2 popular radio announcers at the time. For my fellow Americans out there, it is described as essentially similar to David Letterman in the old days. The program was a mag-prog, or magazine program, with comedy sketches, musical performances, and even a few stunts. In fact, stunts were actually a regular occurrence on the show. The segment Give It a Whirl encouraged members of the public to call in, spin the whirly wheel, and choose a stunt. After a week of training, this person would go on the show the next week and then perform the stunt in front of a live studio audience. The Late Late Breakfast Show went through its fair share of controversies, but there was one which would ultimately end the show altogether. The BBC had actually been threatened with legal action from the health and safety executive twice before this incident occurred, due to the unsafe nature of these stunts. I mean, one of these planned stunts was plucking a member of the public from an exploding chimney by helicopter, so yeah, sounds pretty dangerous. The BBC even agreed, saying that a lot of these stunts were some of the most daring feats that were ever performed on British television. However, legal action was never taken, even as a few people would experience minor and major injuries from these stunts. Then, on November 8th of 1986, 24 Michael Lush from Southampton was put up by his girlfriend for the whirly wheel. He would call in, spin the wheel, and land on a stunt called Hang 'em High. Hang 'em High involved being suspended 120 feet in the air via crane in nothing but a wooden box with a dropped floor. The idea was to escape from the box and bungee jump out of the bottom as it quote-unquote exploded. However, when Lush arrived on the set to do a rehearsal run, he learned that no professional stuntman had actually even tried to perform this stunt to see if it was even doable. The production team did offer somebody to try before Lush, but he was super eager to get going, and so he just went ahead anyway. Again, this is someone who was never trained as a stuntman and had never seen the stunt that he was about to perform be done. Now just standing 120 feet in the air in a box whose floor was about to drop out from under him. He was obviously nervous. It took Lush a while to get the courage up to jump. But once he finally did, something went terribly wrong. Familiar to, anyone who's ever done any climbing, the bungee carabiner clip attached to the top of the crane as he jumped sprang loose. This would cause him to fall 120 feet through the air completely free of the cord, hit the ground, and die instantly. Now, obviously, there are a plethora of issues surrounding this tragedy. First was the fact that there was no airbag below the stunt, which would have been standard practice. And on top of that, bafflingly, there were no emergency services on set that day. No ambulances, nothing. Though there was a safety officer on the payroll, he was not present for the day of the stunt. It also came to light that Lush had only been able to begin training 2 days before he was here, and he had never actually bungee jumped before. There was obviously an investigation as well after this incident. One of the first things they did was test the clip that Lush used. On 20 different tests, the clip sprang loose 14 times. And he had also only jumped with one singular bungee cord. Specialists said they had attempted the same thing with 3 cords at minimum. The production team also claimed to have an expert on hand for the stunt. However, it was discovered that he was not really an expert in bungee jumping or climbing or anything. It was more theatrical tricks. The BBC had been warned before that without proper consultation of experts like that, these stunts could result in injury or death. Therefore, it was very easy to prosecute them this time. However, the fine would only be a mere £2,000 or about $10,000 in USD. The BBC would also contribute around $400,000 to Lush's family. The HSE also pointed out that a stunt like this would never, ever be attempted without airbags. And even if it was done by a professional stuntman, it would have taken weeks and maybe even months of preparation. The interesting thing is, the show was allegedly cancelled in the UK after this incident. However, it would simply just be rebranded under a few different names and ultimately become incredibly successful as Noel's House Party in the 1990s. In this video, I've talked about accidents that all happened decades ago, when safety regulations obviously weren't as tight as they are now. I don't think anything like I talked about would happen again today. In fact, the Twilight Zone incident was one of the first to actually cause industry-wide change. And I don't think these stories are just like super grim trivia, you know what I mean? I'm not talking about them for no reason. I think they're sobering reminders of the very real risks behind the films and shows that we all enjoy. What really stands out to me too is that how every accident doesn't just affect the production, right? But it kind of ripples outward and sparks like cultural debates about like how far we're willing to go for the sake of a movie. And well, regulations have obviously tightened since the early days. I think stories like these show why it's important to, constantly question how safe these sets really are and, how much responsibility the industry itself has to protect them. But that's pretty much it today. It was kind of a more serious video. So thanks for sticking around if you did. If you found this interesting, let me know down below in the comments what you think. Or if there are other cases that you'd like to hear me talk about that I didn't talk about in this one, that'd be cool too. And of course, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you feel like it. I'm not gonna chase ya. Maybe share it with someone who finds it morbidly fascinating like you and I do. I'm Abby, this is 1 Minute Off, and I'm gonna go watch a movie where nobody dies on screen or in real life. Bye.